My understanding, I believe, that the Green Foundation's core mission is in understanding some of the cultural dimensions of the shift we need to make to a greener country, world. And it's in that context, if I can, and use maybe the location of this room, to take a really broad sweep in time, to look at a historical context, using that as given that direction, that this is an issue of cultural understanding we need to get to, as much as technical, political. And I suppose I'm very much influenced in what I'm about to say with the work that I've been doing with another project with the Green Foundation, which is a climate gathering. It's an event we're going to hold in Ballyvaughan in Clare on the 15th, 16th and 17th of February next, bringing people from across the world to get to that actual key point, how the cultural understanding of how we're going to make the leap we need to make to avoid tripping the planet out of the Holocene into a really traumatic geological era. So if I can, that background set a context to some very long-term thinking, because you need to think to understand the cultures where we've come from to try and get a sense of where we might be to go to next. So go back, as nomads, 45,000 years where we're wandering. The key point I want to make, I suppose, is how the culture is influenced by technology. And in that time, our technology we don't know much about the people. I listened to the archaeologist Michael Gibbons very clearly, a fascinating understanding of history. But even he admits we don't know much. Go back 7,000 years, we don't know much beyond that. But the culture must have been determined by the technology, that human voice speaking around probably a communal fire or singing around it. So the culture that came from that, it seems, was mythological, mythology, and it still kind of echoes in us today, some of those stories that they told. It changed. At that point, 7,000, 8,000 years ago, when we changed from being nomads to farm. And in settling down to farm, we needed to keep a record of our store. We needed to be able to sell and not have it stolen. And it was script, was the technology allowed that. Some of this thinking comes from Jeremy Rifkin, Empathetic Civilization has written about that. But that script technology changed the culture to one of mythology to one of theology. Religions, various religions around the world, teaching you how to live in a village, how it's better to share, better to forgive. And that lasted, with a myriad of changes in between, I think, up until that point about 220 years ago, when in rooms like this, across the Western world, we made a leap. And it was a leap which I suppose was accommodated by a whole range of things that had come before it. The start of the Industrial Revolution, invention of steam engine, our humanist thinking coming from Renaissance Europe, Scottish Presbyterian scientific geniuses, German Romanticism, all filtering together. But I would think filtering together to that one moment, when the change in technology that occurred, the arrival of print, allowed us to make a leap. That book that came from New York and was published only a few months later in Grafton Street in Dublin, The Rights of Man, making it that leap that we have rights here and now, not just in the hereafter. And the political culture that changed with that, I would argue, went from one based on theology to one based on ideology, left versus right. A lot of our politics is still in that space, because it was such a profound leap. And that Industrial Revolution evolved in a way, as you say, John, that today it's actually threatening our ability to live within the resources of the planet. And I suppose a lot of that occurred because it has happened because of what happened in the 20th century, when I think maybe we saw further, who was it, Adam Curtis described it as the century of the self, where it was Jung and Freud and psychology, which determined, the technology changed to telecommunications, to television, radio, telegraph, almost like, in a Gaian sense, a kind of nervous system for the planet, connecting us, maybe making us able to see the planet for the first time from afar. And I think in that world, it was psychology which was the dominant political ideology. Advertising, media was where the power existed. And that part of that revolution, or that change in the last century, was very green. If you're looking to see where did the green movement start, where did our revolution start, it was in the 60s. It was in that strange occasion where a country that had won 2 wars came to the realization that war was not the answer. partly because they had television, and they had that photograph of a Vietnamese girl running down a road with her skin stripped off and her clothes stripped off her with one of their napalm bombs. But that changed the whole psychology, the whole way of thinking. And it was green, it was feminist, it was openly gay, it was non-militarist, it was ecumenical. And then I was born roughly in the start of that. I can only really give an actual living testimony of what went on from there on. Just to get to this point, and I'm taking some time, if you bear with me, to understand what comes next. The 70s, very confused time in my mind. Some of those freedoms of the 60s we were still working out. You know, when you look at Top of the Pops now and Jimmy Savile, you kind of get the realization that some of the sexual freedoms we have, whereas I think John P. also described as confusions. And his love of that song, the undertone song, Teenage Kicks, now has a slightly different undertone, looking back 30 years on. I mention punk because I think it is important for my generation. I was 17 when punk arrived in Dublin, 16, 17. It was our culture. It belonged to us. Johnny Finger's aunt lived down the road. You knew someone who knew Bono. And I remember kind of young, God, it must have been very embarrassing, kind of thinking back at poguing away to anarchy in the UK. As if we really meant it. But I think even then we knew we didn't even know what it meant. And I mention it because I think there was a turning point, and I can almost distinctly remember it to the day, almost late 70s, early 80s, whether it was with the election of Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher, but it turned. And it got subsumed, like feminism, with a new market, neoliberal market ideology, which existed for the last 30 years until Enron, Lehman Brothers, Anglo-Irish Bank, and Leveson Inquiry kind of brought some of those corporate powers down, Rupert Murdoch among them. There was a play, and just to get to the point, there was a play I went to see in Dublin about Enron. One of these new plays trying to understand the world by just taking the text from the transcript or from oral hearings. And the leading character and the miscreant character at the end says, yes, but that world, that 30 years of that bubble, that debt bubble we're trying to get over now, it produced two good things. Reagan's spending on military both brought the wall down and China into the World Trade Organization and created a state-supported tech industry in California that delivered the internet. And the character Enron plays says, nothing ever was achieved without excess. Well, maybe that was the excess out of our debt bubble which will leave a legacy that will allow us to make the next transformational leap. Because that opening of the world, that globalization that occurred, I don't believe is going to be reversed. The internet is as fundamental a shift in technology as was the introduction of print, or script, or television, or any of the previous technological leaps that made the cultural change. And if we were trying to understand as to what comes next, if we have gone, as I've argued, from mythology to theology, ideology, psychology, if we're to understand the internet and what's it doing, and to understand globalization and what it's doing, you need an understanding of living interconnected systems. And that is called ecology. It's ecological thinking, which is, I believe, the culture's best fit for this currently changing technological world. And to get the economic and political governance right, we need to understand the characteristics of that ecology. It's complex and difficult, and it's very hard to simplify right down. But I've done it, in the tight time I have here, to my mind, two short concepts, or a number of concepts. It is, in my mind, both collaborative and competitive. Collaborative in the sense that it's open source technology, it works well. It works well when you're sharing files in a fairly easy and open access way. The very internet protocol, the way it was designed, has actually allowed it, given it certain characteristics which support collaboration. It's competitive as well, though, in the sense that it's completely opened up the world competition. I can, on this machine, sell something to someone in China, or find out the most niche demand that someone has in another location, and be able to try and provide it without the huge elaborate infrastructure of previous corporations. And I think, therefore, what we need to do in the evolving political institutions that we have, we need to maintain a collaborative and competitive approach. And the collaborative approach, I would argue, is going to have to be international. I don't believe it will be easy to reverse globalization. I don't believe, firstly, our people will buy it. And secondly, I would have feared that if we did it, we would start to see the resilience issue, the fight for the remaining resources, turning into a fight. It will not work if we try and reverse back from globalization and we have a continental battle for those resources, or even, I don't think it'll work if we go back to a regional, national, or local level. I think we're going to have to work it on a global cooperative basis. And that's where I believe the importance of the European Union comes in. I think it has been the best example of nation-state cooperation. And I think what we're going to have to do now is to give it the power to be able to negotiate a new collaborative international order. I read a friend of mine, or saw her giving a lecture going into Berkeley, that expert in international constitutional law, making the point that Europe was founded on 3 initial goals. Peace, primarily, having a continent having torn itself apart, the delivery of prosperity, and even just showing the ability to create a supranational institution. They have been achieved. The new goal for the European Union, the new role for the European Union, is taking this new collaborative, international, globalized leap in politics and being the leading player in delivering what we need to a new international sustainable order. I worry, John, what you said earlier on, that we've kind of given up on the capability of us actually living within the resource limits of the planet. I actually think, and I suppose having worked with you in the area for 10 years, that the power of the internet, that doubling of computing power every 2 years that's still going to occur for the next 20 years, combined with a war on efficiency, which is the new economic opportunity that exists across this world, does make it possible for us to actually completely turn the course of industrial revolution into a resource limit, successful resource limit economy. I mean, if we weren't throwing away half our fish overboard as excess bycatch, if we weren't throwing away half our food that we buy, if we weren't throwing away 2/3 of the heat energy that we generate in our fossil fuel power plants up a chimney, there's massive opportunities, and one of the things the internet economy is doing is showing where those opportunities are and giving people the opportunity to create economic investment and economic employment out of actually reducing that waste. There's a brilliant book by young Australian James Bradfield Moody called Sixth Wave, which is showing that that is the economic opportunity. That is going to determine global investment and employment for the next 30 years. And it is the use of the internet that makes it happen, makes it possible. But what it also needs is global governance. It needs to keep it competitive, certain international rules that allow you to do it. The global governance around climate and on a number of issues is dead at the moment. International is not working. We don't have rules on migration. We don't have the Doha development around developing. The UNFCCC is stalled. But I think the role for Europe is to actually start it working again as a model of a cooperative, collaborative and competitive political organisation. Why not use Europe's power to go to the Chinese and the Americans and say, from now on we're going to have to count the carbon that's embodied in manufacturing goods. And that overnight would switch off those coal power plants and fire up a new clean alternative energy economy. We have succeeded, we have evolved in moving from that tribal basis to the village, in moving from the village to a nation state, which was better than the previous warlording that we particularly had in this country. We now need to make the next evolutionary leap forward. It needs politically to be in tune with what's happening in the technology that is revolutionising the way the world works. And that's what I think. I'm very proud to be here today to share some of those thoughts in a room where a previous revolution and evolution occurred. Thank you.